Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in. On the 13th anniversary of 9/11, we thought it would be important to get together and talk about why 9/11 truth and investigating what really happened on 9/11/2001 is still so important all of these years later. And two of my good friends have been kind enough to join me for this conversation. We have Chris Duane from SilverShieldExchange.com and his YouTube channel Truth Never Told. And of course, our friend Jeff Nielson from BullionBullsCanada.com. So first we'll say hi to Chris. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing excellent. I'm real happy to be here with you and Jeff today. I've told you earlier, I've been reading Jeff's articles for so many years and never really had a chance to reach out and speak with him. So this is a great opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. And Jeff, how are you?
Not too bad. And as Chris said, it's nice for me to get together with this three-way as well, so I can touch base with somebody who I've long been aware of, but never been in touch with.
Wow, so it's the first time you guys have ever spoken?
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that. That's great. Well, it's a small community, and but it's a community that's having a big impact on the world. And one of the things I wanted to do is talk to you guys about the excuse which 9/11 is still being used for, the pretext for continual wars of aggression, wars against our liberties at home with the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, the police state, the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the John Warner Defense Authorization Act, stripping us of our liberties at every turn. Don't you guys find it stunning that after all of these years, the media, the mainstream media, and even major aspects of the alt media still hold the official story and peddle the official story and the official lies for this establishment?
They better try hard to hide this, because knowing what the effect of 9/11 truth had on me in my life, they can't afford to have the public wake up to this. And there's a great deal amount of denial and deception that has gone into maintaining the 9/11 lie. When I look back at what had happened to me, I mean, the day after 9/11, I was in the Marines, and I mean, I remember going to Picatinny Arsenal, which is our Marine base, on guard duty, and the hours after 9/11 happened, I mean, the words came out of my mouth. I said, I think we should nuke 5 different nations in the Middle East, because we don't know who it was, but they need to know that we're king boss. And I mean, I was hardcore neocon, right wing, ready to go murder innocent Muslims right after 9/11. And then, got activated for a year and got out in 2003. And it wasn't until 2005 that I woke up to 9/11 truth. And it was, the documentary Loose Change that really opened my eyes and started having me question everything. It wasn't just 9/11. It led me down to the path of questioning the Federal Reserve, what my life was, what consumerism was. Is this all a fake, and the housing bubble, and get myself involved in silver, and ultimately ended up leaving my job and, moving to another part of the country. I mean, it had a dramatic effect on me, and 9/11 is that, that crystallizing issue that kind of will unwind your world if you let it. And I feel that far too many people won't even look at 9/11 because, number one, they're afraid of, if that is possible, they're afraid of what their government could do or what evil is out there, so they'd rather not even look at the issue. I mean, I remember one girl I talked to, she said, finding out about 9/11, and I gave her all this stuff. She said that would be like finding out my father's gay. Like, it was just one of those things that she just didn't want to think about. And then the other part is there's a grand majority of people who benefit off of the debt and death that is spread in the name of 9/11, people who are making record profits and margins and are living a life far greater than they could if the dollar wasn't this king, backed up by this lie. So I think that there's a great deal amount of denial and deception that are playing into this. And ultimately, those people who are holding on to them are the ones that are going to suffer the most when this all falls apart.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on 9/11? Was it the catalyst to wake you up? Because it's surprising to me to hear from so many people that does seem to be the event that woke all of us up.
Well, my experience was much different than that of Chris because, for one thing, I'm based in Canada. So it wasn't the same personal reaction that it was for American people when the event itself occurred. And then my circumstances were quite different because I was actually laid up with an injury at the time. And so because of that, I was literally glued to my television set, 24/7 for around that time. And of course, in particular in the day itself, watching the recording over and over again, which they deliberately played a million times as part of the brainwashing. And part of the reason that I guess the truth sunk in for me a little bit quicker was because of that. And, I was sitting there, watching this surreal clip over and over again and watching the buildings fall down. And then, of course, the thought occurred to me, gee, isn't it incredibly lucky how those two tall skyscrapers crashed directly down to the foundations rather than toppling sideways, which, of course, was the only natural thing to happen when a building is struck in the side. And, of course, then, thinking along those lines further, it's like, gee, it's almost like they did a demolition. And then, of course, a couple days later when the shock wears off, it's like, well, no, it wasn't almost like a demolition. It was a demolition. And then, of course, we have the forensic evidence emerging where you have independent experts examining the site, finding residue of military-style, ultra-high temperature explosives, which could only be there if it had been used for a demolition. We have one tower which simply fell down by itself. So, I mean, the thing which strikes me about this and scares me, of course, so much is that the official account is totally impossible. This isn't like the Kennedy assassination where there's, some major inconsistencies and it's, almost impossible. This is physically impossible that events could have occurred as they were described. And then, I also picked up on something Chris said when he was talking about a personal anecdote, and he mentioned his friend who said, gee, it'd be like finding out that her father was gay if she knew the truth about 9/11. And, the reason that struck me so much is because that sort of conditioned response is exactly what you would expect to get from somebody who's been brainwashed. Because, of course, what happens when we're brainwashed is we're programmed, literally, with particular beliefs, or, of course, programmed to not have particular beliefs. And when those when that programming is challenged, one of two things occurs. There's either a fear reaction or there's a hostility reaction. And in other words, the person either thinks, gee, I'm with a crazy person, I better try to get away from this person, or else they react in a hostile manner. It's like, oh, you're crazy, how could you say anything that's stupid, blah, blah, blah. And of course, whenever we see that, it's immediate indication of brainwashing. And so that's, one of the first things that people need to focus upon is the reason that the lie has held is because we're dealing with brainwashed populations now, not merely deceived populations, but totally brainwashed populations that are incapable of examining the issues objectively and looking at the facts objectively. So this is what we're dealing with here, and this is why it's such a serious issue because, we're dealing with tyrannical governments which are using military-style brainwashing to control their populations, and we see how effective it's been.
Let me ask you guys, what is that syndrome called when you, if you're kidnapped and then you learn to love your captors? I forget. Stockholm syndrome. Thank you. Yeah, I think the American people are largely suffering from Stockholm syndrome because they've learned to love their captors, the big banks, those that get bailouts at every turn. The elite in this country are capable of any crime, and they're also able to get away with any crime. It seems all crimes by the elite go unpunished. And you were talking about the discovery of the essentially the nanothermites in the WTC ground zero dust, and it was the work of Dr. Stephen Jones from BYU that really woke me up, and he did such a wonderful job along with David Ray Griffin, and then of course those two gentlemen woke up Richard Gage, who founded AE 9/11 Truth. AE 9/11 Truth is putting a video billboard, a huge video billboard up in Times Square here just in time for 9/11, and they are going to broadcast the collapse of WTC-7 for all New Yorkers to see. It's uplifting to me that after more than a decade, after 13 years, the effort to get the truth out is still alive, and it's so important because as we see, the powers that be are going to continue to use 9/11 to take us into war with Muslims and to take us into more wars in the Middle East and to rebrand Al-Qaeda as ISIS. And then we have to remember we got hit hard on 9/11 by Al-Qaeda, which is now ISIS, even though bin Laden's dead, and he was dead, but no, then he came back to life, and then we killed him, and then all the SEALs were killed in a chopper crash that were supposedly involved in killing bin Laden. It's just lies on top of lies on top of lies. I just want to mention another researcher, Kevin Ryan. Kevin Ryan worked for Underwriters Laboratories and was a whistleblower early on, not even a whistleblower. He wanted to aid the 9/11 Commission in their research about the collapse of those buildings because he knew the steel that comprised the World Trade Centers was Underwriters Labs certified and could not melt by fire. And as soon as he got involved in trying to share his knowledge, he lost his job. He went on to write one of the most powerful articles that I've ever seen about 9/11, and it's called The Top 10 Connections Between NIST and Nanothermites. And I recommend everyone read it because NIST refused to look at the evidence of potential explosions or nanothermites or thermites or any sort of reactive material that could have led to the collapse of those buildings. NIST was tasked with explaining the collapse of the buildings, and then they admitted they would never look at and did not look at any evidence for explosives. And then Kevin Ryan points out that many of the people on NIST are directly related to nanothermites and that industry. What do you guys find is maybe what are the top couple anomalies, Chris, in your mind that you found stunningly unbelievable about the official story?
I think the easiest one is World Trade Center 7. I'm glad that they're putting up that video billboard because it's anybody who looks at that. I mean, the Shanksville crash and the Pentagon and all that other stuff. World Trade Center 7, completely collapsed within itself at almost faster than the speed of gravity. Wasn't hit by any planes. There were small fires in it. All the tenants of the building are a list of spooky or banker of buildings. I think the NSA had their office there. The CIA, the FBI, the SEC that was investigating all the Enron files that happened to go there, and this all completely collapsed. And Jeff mentioned earlier when he said that these buildings cannot physically fall apart unless it was a demolition. I remember watching the buildings fall, and my instant reaction was that's impossible. And yet the programming that I had from my entire life, and the visualization of this going over and over again, and the fear and the uncertainty and all that stuff that they pumped in there, I put that one thought, that's impossible, that these buildings could fall through the path of most resistance, which is their structural steel and concrete encased in these massive, overly done buildings, how they could possibly go through the path of most resistance when Jeff is right. They should have just fallen onto the side, but they didn't. They fell into complete vertical collapse. And then short of World Trade Center 7, man, the Pentagon getting hit by a plane, show me a plane that hits there. Show me, fuselages. We've seen all these plane crashes where there's, acres and acres of just, seats and tires and stuff like that. The Pentagon attack with this 18-foot hole directly in the side of the Pentagon, blowing through there. There's 86 cameras that could have caught the video on there, and all we got is these 3 frames. All the videotapes were all confiscated. There's no doubt in my mind that the Pentagon was hit by some sort of either cruise missile or something along their line, but there was definitely not some jumbo airliner that happened to make all these crazy turns and then fly a few feet off the ground to hit into this, 7-story building on the side that I think was also housing all the information about the $2.4 trillion that was missing from the Pentagon that Donald Rumsfeld just happened to announce the day before 9/11.
That's right.
So, I mean, there's and I've done whole videos where there's hundreds of unanswered questions, and these are just stuff, bloggers are doing. This isn't, the 9/11 Commission or, stuff. This is just what rational individuals that have a logical sense of looking at a crime scene and all the stuff that has happened after it look at this stuff and say, even if one of these things are wrong, it's well worth looking into all of it.
Well, that's right. And I want to back you up on what you're saying about the Pentagon. But first, I want to say that Ron Paul is also being maligned. Here in an article by the Daily Beast, Ron Paul dons 9/11 truth or tinfoil. And of course, they're going after him because, according to this hacky author, she says that the former congressman and father of the frontrunner for the GOP presidential nomination thinks the government is keeping secrets about 9/11 and goes on to malign him, even though he's talking really about stuff that's already on the record. We know that several of the 9/11 commissioners themselves say that there's information that was covered up and information that should be made public. We know that there's 28 pages of redacted classified information, which only some members of Congress have been able to see and have been horrified by what they read. And that is yet to be made public. And I want to back you up about that hole in the Pentagon, Chris. I've always been amused by the fact that they told us that was a Boeing. And if you look at that hole and you imagine the Boeing with an engine on each wing, I defy you to find the entry holes for those engines, those titanium engines, in the Pentagon. There are no entry holes for those engines. And if you look at pictures, the engines are not on the outside of the building either. But what I found what I found really remarkable about 9/11 was the testimony of Norman Mineta, the former Department of Transportation Secretary, his on-the-record sworn testimony in front of the 9/11 Commission saying that while he was in the PIAC below the White House and Dick Cheney was in charge, a young officer would come in and say, "Sir, the plane is 50 miles out." The officer would come back in and say, "Sir, the plane is 30 miles out."
And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, "Do the orders still stand?" And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
Pentagon. Yeah.
And this was sworn testimony by a man who has no reason to lie. And if you guys recall, Dick Cheney and George Bush refused to do sworn testimony and would only give their testimony in close quarters with their attorneys present off the record. Jeff, what do you find most impactful about the 9/11 official story?
Well, I try to stick just to the pure science. And, so what I start with is the simple science which is involved in the demolition of any building. And as a matter of physics, there is only one way to get a structure to collapse straight downward. And it's by blowing the bottom floors out first. Because the only way a building can fall straight down is, as Chris was talking about, if there's no structure blocking it. So you can never have a building collapse straight down, pop down, because of course the top floor would hit the next floor and then it would start to spray sideways, et cetera, et cetera. The only way a building can ever collapse straight down is to be blown from the bottom up. So, the simple fact that we saw the buildings collapse in that manner is physical proof that it was a demolition. But then of course we go to more incontrovertible science, which is basically that still to this day, nowhere in the entire world has there ever been another documented example of steel reinforced buildings collapsing due to fire. That's no steel reinforced building anywhere else in the world in the history of engineering. And of course, these weren't simply ordinary steel reinforced buildings. These were steel reinforced structures explicitly designed to survive contact with an airliner. So, this is additionally an additional level of impossibility on top of this. The building must have been a demolition because it collapsed straight down. It couldn't have possibly collapsed due to fire because no steel reinforced building has ever collapsed due to fire. And, of course, being, hit in an airliner in the side, if anything was going to happen, we would have seen the building topple sideways. And of course, this is another important point. From the moment that the airliner struck the building, it created this tremendous risk of a large portion of this skyscraper breaking off and toppling sideways. And imagine if it would have toppled sideways, the carnage that would have been created. And of course, so this is the whole point. From the moment of impact, it would have been obvious that they would have needed to take the buildings down in a demolition to remove that horrific risk of the top portion toppling sideways and causing some catastrophic chain reaction as it struck other structures. But yet, nowhere in the reporting on that day did I hear a single person ever use the word demolition. It was never used. It was verboten. That was one word that nobody could ever use. And of course, it was so surreal that at one point I'm listening to this so-called engineering expert being interviewed on CNN and saying, well, yeah, this changed everything we know about, engineering. We're going to have to rewrite the textbooks. Well, I challenge anybody to find a textbook that's been rewritten as a result of 9/11. What we simply have is this impossible anomaly which defies all known science. And of course, that's part of the reason that the movement has stayed alive, because it's not just absurdity, it's impossibility.
Well, and I just want to say before we throw it back to Chris there that Dan Rather on the day of 9/11 when WTC-7 was collapsing, you can find this on YouTube. You can see Dan Rather watching the tape of WTC-7 collapsing, saying, it looks like one of those classic demolitions.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
It was the only time he ever said it, and I don't think he ever said it again.
Or he's been alive to repeat it.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what's funny about World Trade Center 7. NIST, which was tasked with explaining the collapse of that building and the other two, took, I think, Chris, maybe you know this, can correct me if I'm wrong, took, I think, 6-7 years to finally come out with a report about World Trade Center 7, because, of course, they couldn't explain the collapse of World Trade Center 7 if they excluded the use of explosives. And because they did exclude the use of explosives in their explanation, they came up with a model so secret that it's literally classified. They've come out with a model that, in their minds, or to the satisfaction of the government, explains the collapse of World Trade Center 7, but the data that was used to create the model is secret. Nobody's ever seen it, and they say it would endanger public safety if they were to release the information. So that model is worthless. It's 100% totally worthless. So if you look at any of the WTC-7 debunked videos or debunked sites out there, they won't tell you that. They'll just say, well, NIST explained it, and it was due to fires.
Well, it is dangerous to the public. It would be a shock to the system that their government was complicit, or elements of the government were complicit in a false flag that dragged us into a now 13-year-long war that has cost this country over, $6 trillion, and has cost millions of lives. And for what? For the power and profit of these psychopathic oligarchs that we empower every day with our careers, our investments, our debts. And it'd be shocking for people to figure out that, geez, we're really empowering the worst in humanity, and that they intend to drag us off to war. And if we don't support them, they might turn their guns on us.
Well, Sean, I would like to focus on one particular point from what you just said, which is this whole business about this explanation for the collapse of Tower 7 being classified to, quote unquote, protect public safety. Now, here's the point of logic. If, in fact, this collapse was an accident, which is, of course, is the official lie, then getting the truth out there would enhance public safety by allowing people all over the world to take into account this particular risk and prepare for it. The only way that you could create risk by divulging what happened is if the tower was collapsed as a result of a deliberate act, and that could be repeated by somebody else.
That's right.
So if it was an accident, it could not possibly be classified. It could only be classified it was a deliberate act. So by classifying it, they prove it was a deliberate act.
Well, that's right. And I want to circle back to this Ron Paul article, because those of us who were fans of Ron Paul and maybe remain fans of Ron Paul like I do, loved the man for his ability to speak truth and speak with common sense. And all he's been saying about 9/11, if you followed him for any period of time, you know this was always how he felt. But of course, it isn't politically expedient or safe to discuss 9/11 truth in the establishment, because they will label you a crazy person, because that's the CIA playbook. That is literally the design. After the JFK assassination, they came out with the idea of labeling those who would question the assassination of JFK, quote unquote, conspiracy theorists. It's a playbook that they've been using now for decades. And all Ron Paul was saying is that, quote, it's politically very risky to talk about 9/11. And he went on to say, for which he's being lambasted and made to look a fool by the Daily Beast, because they, of course, are gatekeepers. He's saying, quote, I've come to the conclusion that all government commissions are designed to protect the government. I believe that if we ever got the full truth about 9/11, we'll find out that our government had it in the records exactly what the plans were, or at least close to it, end quote. Now, you have to realize, again, that there are 28 redacted pages, maybe it's 32 redacted pages of the 9/11 Commission report that they will not allow the public to see. And I'm going to tell you guys something. Here's my personal belief. I think that those redacted pages implicate the Saudis specifically and probably make absolutely no mention of the Mossad. And it's my personal belief that this was an event, a false flag event, that definitely had Mossad fingerprints on it, as well as probably Saudi intelligence fingerprints, as well as more than likely CIA or other American intelligence agency fingerprints. That's my opinion. What say you?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, the Benjamin Netanyahu quote on one of those HBO shows that, that they have the United States as their secret weapon, or something to that effect, means that Israel has been very prominent in manipulating the United States into conducting their foreign policy. I mean, if you look at what we've done to the Middle East, all we have done is wreaked havoc all over there and destabilized even the most moderate Arab nations around there into creating a mess for them. And it's ironic, we're talking about how the playbook that was played out in 9/11 is now being rejigged up for, ISIS, which is now this, I think they use the word terrific and incredible, a powerful ISIS that now has their own Air Force. And I think I just read on your site today, their own Navy, and that they're bigger and badder than Al-Qaeda. It's ironic that, all these extreme jihadist terrorists never seem to mention Israel. I even saw an article today that said if Scotland breaks away from the UK, the jihadists are going to go after the Scottish. You would think that these radical Muslim jihadists would be going after Israel, and they never mention them.
No, your point is a good one. I was talking to my mom yesterday, in fact, and I asked her, how things going, what's up, and she said, I'm just so distracted by this ISIS thing and these beheadings. It's just horrible. And I said, Mom, they're rebranding Al-Qaeda. The new name's ISIS because they've run out of boogeymen. And if you want to take a look at those beheading videos, I can tell you this, that the man dressed in black supposedly doing the beheading has a British accent. So can you say MI6? Can you say CIA? Can you say intelligence operations? We're being manipulated again. And getting back to this Israeli component, the 5 Israelis arrested on 9/11 were then sent back to Israel, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 60 days after their arrest. And they went on an Israeli talk show, and they talked about videotaping the event.
And at that point, we were taken for another round of questioning, this time related to our allegedly being members of Mossad. The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event. Our purpose was to document the event.
Our purpose was to document the event. And one would ask, I guess, if one had critical thinking skills, how would they have known to have been in Manhattan to document the event if they didn't have prior knowledge? It's the most fundamental question. It's the most basic question, and it doesn't make me an anti-Semite to ask it.
No, no. It simply questioning. That's one of the benefits of being logical. By asking questions, there's no, racism in it. If you ask a question, that speaks truth, and what's the matter with that? No, no one should fear that.
Jeff, any thoughts from you here before we wrap up?
It's just a matter of my head sort of spinning with so many things. I always flash back to events before 9/11, and of course looking at them in hindsight now. And one of the things that has always struck me as perhaps the most outrageous factoid of all was the fact that during the summer of 2001, weeks before the event, we had U.S. neocons such as Richard Pearl going around giving speeches to all of their neocon buddies saying, you know, what the U.S. really needs today is, quote unquote, another Pearl Harbor. And then, weeks later, we get this event. I can't speak for other people. I simply don't believe in coincidences like that.
Yeah, that was the Project for a New American Century. People can look that up, PNAC, PNAC. It was a think tank that had, every single neocon you can possibly imagine, including people like Dick Cheney, Jeb Bush, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Don Rumsfeld, all these chicken hawks that seek to create war. They look for a way
behind
of
the desk.
From behind the desk, knowing that they have to fool us into doing this for them, because not one of them would ever actually go out and do anything themselves.
Yeah,
but Sean, one of the reasons why I think this 9/11 issue is so important, that the movement is still alive today, is because they're going to try to use it again. And I think that's ultimately what drives all of these truth tellers, that they've spent hours upon hours, years, trying to get people to see that and document this, because they are going to use this again. The one thing about the psychopaths is that they're not creative. They have been using the same Hegelian dialectic since Diocletian, and they've been using it over and over again. The thing that I am most hopeful, though, this time around, Sean, is that back in 2001, the internet was not what it is today. I don't even think YouTube existed. Most people had AOL accounts and dial-up, and, it was still kind of this murky thing. And I think the wonderful thing that's been going on now since 9/11 is that the path has now been laid where the internet is very pervasive. It's everywhere. That the people that are in the truth-telling community have really honed their skills in developing this, and that probably 5 to 6, 7 years later, if you look at the success record of these criminal psychopaths into getting us into more wars, they've really come across a lot of problems. Remember when Dick Cheney was trying to incite a war with Iran by having these American-made PT boats?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Seymour Hersh
Yep.
let that out. You look at the failure of what they did with Syria and the 1,000 people that died of chemical weapons, and then the UN coming out saying, it was probably the Syrian rebels that actually killed those people. There's been more and more roadblocks thrown in there simply because humanity's starting to wake up. And I had always hoped that, when I got out there and started telling these things that, we would wake up these people. But I tell you who is waking up and is fully aware of this anti-hegemon of China, Russia, Iran, India, Germany. All these other major nations are going, wait a minute, guys, we see this game. And I think that while I don't expect a grand awakening of the American people, I think there's far too many people who are either too afraid or benefit from it. But I think the change is going to come from outside the system when it's enforced on us. And I think the closer we get now, where we're 6 years past the financial crisis, and that's the root of all these things. The reason why they pull off these wars is because they need to keep this Ponzi scheme going. And unless they create new debt or steal new resources, the whole system falls apart. And I think that that's where we're getting to. We're getting to the point now where this financial system is going to come unwinding again, that they need to pull this off again. And I think that the desperation of them trying to pull this off with an aware internet population and this huge counterweight that's been built over the last centuries of all these nations that have not benefited from this Anglo-American empire, are going to spell the end of the dollar and a transformation forced onto us where we're no longer going to be able to either profit from this debt and death or be in denial of it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll tell you, the bottom line for me, you guys, is that as this criminal establishment targets Syria, Ukraine and Putin, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, at every turn they use ISIS now as the reason for continuing the expansion of American imperialism and unconstitutional wars. And it scares people who aren't informed, people like my mother who get scared by what they watch on Fox News, gatekeeper, or CNN, gatekeeper, or the Daily Beast or Huffington Post, gatekeepers. And the bottom line is, for listeners who want to share this with others, go and look at Operation Gladio. Investigate the Gulf of Tonkin false flag, the Joint Chiefs proposal through the Operation Northwoods false flag, the Kennedy assassination, more recently the 7/7 London bombings, which were absolutely a false flag.
Today we were running an exercise for a company, bearing in mind I'm now in the private sector, and we sat everybody down in the city, 1,000 people involved in the whole organisation, but the crisis team, and the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the Underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real. And one of the first things is, get that bureau number. When you have a list of people missing, tell them. And it took a long time.
Just to get this right, you were actually working today on an exercise that envisioned virtually this scenario.
Almost precisely. I was up until 2 o'clock this morning because it's our job, my own company, Advisor Consultants. We specialise in helping people to get their crisis management response. How do you jump from slow time thinking to quick time doing? And we chose a scenario with their assistance which is based on a terrorist attack because they're very close to a property occupied by Jewish businessmen. They're in the city. A property occupied by Jewish businessmen. They're in the city. Jewish businessmen. And there are more American banks in the city than there are in the whole of New York. A logical thing to do. And I've still got the...
I was going to say, how extraordinary today must feel for you as it unfolds.
Take a look at IRS lies in targeting individual constitutionalists. Take a look at the Benghazi lies, Fast and Furious gun running, the Federal Reserve lies, trillions for banks in 2008 and beyond through QE, the MH17 false flag, right, where Kiev shot down that airliner and the United States government and the Kiev puppet government tried to put that on Putin. Take all of this in its totality and ask yourself, when will you stop? When will you break your Stockholm Syndrome? When will you face the truth and stand with us for liberty? Because the only way that we can take this country back is if everybody gets informed and stands up and says, hell no. No more war, no more ISIS video brainwashing, no more fake beheadings. There's not one more thing that you people can do that are going to get us to support your wars of imperialism without end. Because wars of imperialism without end only spell doom for you and me and our children. And we need to break the cycle.
I fully agree. I've been doing this little video series on my YouTube channel called The Rise and the Fall of the Bankster. And I've documented the last 100 years, really starting from the Federal Reserve, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the false flags that led into the World War I, and then all the debt and death that has followed over this past century. And the final series, I'm writing the script now, is called The End of the Line. And in The End of the Line, they've been able to do this for thousands of years. I mean, you can look back to Diocletian. You can look at almost every single major war. There's always been some subversive criminal element that is seek to foment war for power and profit. But like I said at the end of this video, this is going to be the first time that they're going to try to do this when it's most important. The dollar is the single key behind all of this. If the dollar collapses, they cannot pull off these wars. They cannot control the media. They cannot control the politics. They cannot control everything. And we're at the point now where we're having these exponential debts with a collapsing economy, aging population, falling energy returns. You look at the drought in California. I mean, all these systemic problems are going against them, and they're going to be forced to go for one more time. They're going to try to fake one more major war, and that's where people are going to finally see that this is something that can be stopped if we just stop believing them, stop paying attention to them, and say no more. So I fully agree with you, Sean. People need to wake up and prepare for this. There is a harsh reality that's coming, and I keep trying to tell people, get your mind wrapped around of stop worrying about these things outside of your control like ISIS and all this other stuff. If I were to talk to your mom, Sean, I'd say stop worrying about things outside of your control and focus solely on the things that you can control. If you're worried about the dollar, then buy silver and gold. If you're worried about the economy falling apart, start becoming working for yourself. If you're worried about riots, make sure that you got a good group of friends. Focus on real friends, real skills, and real assets, and you're going to be better off than most people who are still got their heads in the sand.
Well, very well said. And I know we're all feeling a little bit burned out at this point. We're feeling burned out by economic warfare these guys seem to never lose. They seem to only be able to beat those of us who are trying to do the right thing. And I guess we're all feeling a little bit burned out. Jeff, are you going to continue writing? I know that you had talked about maybe hanging it up here because you've said everything you need to say. You gonna stay in the fight with us?
Well, that's what I wanted to address, actually, because, sometimes it feels like we're not actually reaching anybody at all. And then, of course, there's an incident like this personal anecdote which occurred to me just a couple of weeks ago. I was just finished a workout. I was in the sauna relaxing, and there was two other gentlemen in there with me, neither of which I'd ever seen before in my life. One of them was 15 to 20 years older than me. One was 15 to 20 years younger than me. And I think it was the older gentleman that first started talking and, mentioned something to do with so-called current events. And, then it was just kind of like this 2 against 1 thing because, immediately I jumped in with, well, you can't believe anything you read in the media. And then the younger gentleman chimed in similarly. And, it was almost like hearing a younger version of myself speaking because he was saying the same sort of things I was saying, and with an equal amount of vehemence. And so I think, part of the mythology that the fascists have created is that nobody is being reached, that, this monolith of propaganda and brainwashing has been totally undented by events over the past decade. And that's not true. At the very least, I think the youth of our societies is becoming extremely skeptical and extremely disillusioned. And those are not the ingredients for sheep. Those are the ingredients for revolution. So I believe that change is coming, and whether I continue to write over the next immediate while or not, it remains to be seen because I do believe that there isn't a lot more to say at the moment. I think that something big is coming. And of course, when it happens, naturally I'm going to have things to say again. But, it almost feels like at the moment I'm just holding my breath.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff. When he wrote his article that he was done, I reached out to Sean. That's what precipitated this whole call. I reached out to Sean. I said, "Can you give me Jeff's email address?" And I had my I'm done thing January 31st of last year, and I did a video said I'm done. And in the video, I said that I'm gonna stop preaching to the choir. I'm going to just start focusing on doing things that, immediately impact my life and mainly focusing on real friends, real skills, and real assets. And when I wrote Jeff, I said, I'm reminded in this time of reflection that I've kind of stepped back and, I've just been uploading my Sons of Liberty Academy, which I did 4 years ago. I mean, I got hundreds of videos that I did back then, but I've been uploading it to the YouTube channel and, focusing on my coin designs and, stuff of that nature, and writing a book called A Decade of Denial and Deception. And in that time period, I wrote to Jeff, I said, I'm reminded of Plato with the cave. And the cave is this allegory that Plato talked about how, picture a humanity that's inside of a cave with their heads chained so that they cannot move their heads, and that they're looking at images on the cave wall from a fire behind them, and the casting of shadows of these different creatures and images and stuff, and that these people who have been chained their entire lives, focusing in on this shadows and fire, think that that's their reality, and that the people there that can predict the shadows and the fire got more, were looked upon as great people because they were able to predict when these shadows would appear. And then the person that was able to leave the cave and see that it was just a fire with people holding puppets up and actually left and went out into the sun and saw the reality of the world and how beautiful it is, and the trees and the lights and stuff like that, and that represented the truth. Well, those people then went back into the cave, and when they told the people that they were looking at illusions and fires and this is not real and that the real world is outside the cave, those people hated him. And I feel like, Plato 2,000 years ago figured out what Jeff and I and Sean we're burned out. We've seen the light of truth. We've tried to tell other people about it, and yet it's really our duty to continue to do this, to try to wake people up. Because here's one thing that kind of gives me hope. I look at the trillions of dollars of think tanks and monetary funding and media manipulation and Madison Avenue, psychological, all these things gone in there to control humanity, control it, and it's a ton of energy, a ton of complexity, a ton of integration that has to happen in order to hold the lid on this lie. Okay, and the wonderful thing about the truth, and particularly 9/11 and any of these issues, is once you hear the truth, once you start questioning that reality, it all unwinds, and it's effortless, and it's abundant, and it lasts forever. I'll never, ever put those blinders back on again. It'll never happen to me. And all it took was some kid putting on some YouTube video called Loose Change, and that allowed me to open up my life and physically change my world, and allow me to do 700 videos on YouTube and all that other stuff. And I hope that one of my videos or one of Jeff's articles or one of Sean's articles on his site plucks that one question that gets people to go, I never thought of that before. Because that's what's the key. That once you've freed that mind, it'll never be undone again. And I think ultimately, even if we don't wake up everybody, if we wake up that small portion of people who are aware and prepared and have taken action ahead of this, when the dollar collapse happens, that's going to be rock bottom for humanity. And I think all these little seeds that Jeff and Sean and I and all these other truth tellers, Richard Gage from 9/11 Truth, all these little seeds that have been planted are going to be in the hands of those that are aware and prepared. And my grand hope is that those people are the ones that are going to end up uplifting the people around them, and that we could really start a new conscious reality that gets away from this mess that we've been hiding in. The back of the Bible, we hear about the book of Revelation and the apocalypse and, the end of the world. All the apocalypse means is an unveiling and a lifting of telling of truth that's been hidden from humanity. And I can think of nothing that's been more hidden from humanity than the debt and death of these bankers, these criminal psychopaths, this sick element that has infected our media, our money, our politics, our families. And I think once humanity sees this, there's a good chance that we're going to come out of this after this anger phase, after all this stuff is burned out, that there's a golden age of humanity. And I hope that all these little seeds that we've been planting will, flourish into something spectacular on the other side.
Yeah, amen. And I just want to back up something that you said, and it's basically this. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. And 9/11, for I think all three of us, was that defining event that woke us up. And maybe had the powers that be, or the powers that shouldn't be, had they not tried to pull off 9/11, maybe the three of us wouldn't be having this conversation. Maybe we would have never fully woken up. And the fact that they did it, that is the event that changed the world in so many ways, including waking so many of us up. And for those of you that are listening that may be scratching your head and not buying a word of this, and you think we're nuts, I invite you to do a little research. Read David Ray Griffin's 9/11 Omissions and Distortions. Visit ae911truth.com. Visit patriotsquestion911.com. Check out Kevin Ryan's Top 10 Connections Between NIST and Nanothermites. Watch Loose Change, the documentary that was so seminal in waking up so many that Chris mentioned. The bottom line is, show courage like Ron Paul has. Speak truth, spread truth, and let's take our country back. It's our last chance, really. If America falls to these tyrannical monsters, then all hope is lost. And none of the three of us think all hope is lost just yet. I want to thank Chris Duane for joining us and taking the time. Check out his work at Truth Never Told on YouTube. And I want to thank our friend Jeff Nielson from bullionbullscanada.com. Jeff, thank you, sir.
Always great to be here, and it's been a pleasure to talk to Chris.
Thank you. You too, Jeff.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, for putting us together. It was a good show.
All right, you're both good friends, and I do appreciate your time. I want to thank everybody for listening, and please check us out at sgtreport.com. Thank you. Bye-bye.